You know, I'm a firm believer that you should do what you want to do in your target language, that you should definitely enjoy what you are doing when you are learning French, for example. But maybe you love to read, and maybe reading, if you are a beginner, is a little bit complicated at the moment. You kind of want to read, but you're not quite sure that your French is good enough to be able to read a novel, for example, in French. And you're right. Definitely, if you are a beginner, diving into a novel in French is going to be a violent experience. You're going to need to motivate yourself a lot, and you're not going to advance in the novel very rapidly, so you can get bored very quickly if you do it like this. An alternative that you can actually take is reading comics, because reading comics is great for beginners because you have two skills when you're reading comics, right? You actually are reading what the people are saying in the comics, but you're also watching the images, the visuals, and the visuals are here to reinforce what you are going to learn and to reinforce what the story is all about. So comics are a great place to start for beginners, and if you want to read in the future, maybe French novels or French books, definitely start with comics. So in this video, I'm going to give you 10 classic French comics for beginners that you should definitely take a look at. The first one on our list is Tintin. Tintin is probably the most classic of the French-speaking comics, and it follows the adventures of a young, smart journalist with his little dog and his grumpy sailor friend. It's a huge classic. All French people will have read Tintin at one point in their life. I can assure you, when I was a child, I was reading Tintin like it was some drug and I loved it. And it's not just a comic for children, though. It's actually for children and adults. So if you are an adult that you don't want to read overly simplified story, then Tintin is a great place to start. My favorite characters in Tintin are Dupont and Dupont, which are two very bad detectives. And there is another character that I enjoy myself as well. It's Tournesol, and Tournesol is a crazy old inventor. And, you'll see if you read some of the Tintin story, it's definitely a crazy, crazy character. So the stories in Tintin are quite complex and very detailed. I know that Hergé, the author of Tintin, definitely did a lot of research when he was writing Tintin. So if you enjoy modern history, this is the comic for you. Second on our list, if you want something maybe a little bit more light, a little bit lighter, it's Boule. Boule is about a little boy and his dog. So Boule is the boy and Bill is the dog. It's a cocker spaniel. And they kind of play with their friends and they fool around. And they have quite, normal adventures for a child and his dog. They live in the suburbs and they have plenty of friends, including animals. So it's quite a lovely, light comic. It's a good choice if you want short stories, because in Boule et Bill, the comics are actually strips. So you read them, it might be a whole page, but the story doesn't actually follow along all the book. So it's a good place to start. Another classic of French comics is Astérix. Astérix and Obélix are two characters that every French child will be able to name and to recognize. We even have a sort of Disneyland, but just for Astérix in France. And yeah, it's a great story. So all the comics of Astérix starts like this. The year is 50 BC. The Gaul is entirely occupied by the Romans. Well, not entirely. One small village of indomitable Gauls still holds out against the invaders. So it's the story of those Gaulish characters fighting against the Romans and trying to keep their independence. They have a tool for their rebellion, let's say. They use something that is magic, the magical potion that the druid cooks, and this potion takes them on a lot of adventures. So if you enjoy the universe of Astérix, there are actually several movies that are based on Astérix and Obélix. one that I actually mentioned in my French comedies for intermediates, I think he was. So you can go and check that out if you are interested. Another great French-speaking comic is Gaston Lagaffe. Gaston Lagaffe. In French, faire une gaffe means to make a blunder. And Gaston Lagaffe is kind of the king of gaffe. Actually, his name sounds like this. Gaston Lagaffe. Lagaffe would be a blunder. So Gaston works at Le Journal de Spirou, which we'll talk about later again, because it kind of is in the same universe as other comics. So Gaston works at Le Journal de Spirou, which is a newspaper, a magazine. And work is not really his thing, because he's simply extremely lazy. That's what Gaston Lagaffe is. He's very, very lazy. And any task that he is given has a tendency to linger and end up in some sort of catastrophe. But Gaston, at the same time, he's not completely useless, because he is in fact a brilliant inventor. He just needs a lot of time to make his inventions and to create his inventions. And even if in the end, not many people actually understand his inventions, he definitely is doing them. So Gaston Lagaffe is a great comic if you want to laugh, if you want to get attached to a character that is maybe a little bit atypical. That's what Gaston Lagaffe is for. Then we have another totally different kind of comic, and it is Bécassine. Bécassine was actually written for young women, so it's a comic for young women, but it was published in 1905, so it's an old comic for young women, so that makes it very, very special. That's very unusual as well. So Bécassine is une Bretonne, so someone from Brittany. She's a Brittany woman. And you will see that from her traditional costume. She's always wearing a green dress with this sort of Breton hat on her head. And she's a farm girl. And she's not really your traditional farm girl, because she reads, she writes, she even gets her driving license at some point. So she's a very independent woman, but she's not always very smart, and she ends up in a lot of adventures. Now, the character of Bécassine is actually very popular, and you find quite a few derived products with her figure on it. It's definitely something to watch if you to read if you want something very, very simple, because I think Bécassine is not speaking in her comics, so it's interesting to get into. Then we have something completely different, and it is Titeuf. Titeuf is a much more modern comic, because it started to be published in 1992, so it's much more recent than Bécassine, and it's about a little boy. It's about a little boy who starts to get interested in girls. You know, he kind of is going into slowly going into the teenage years. And Titeuf is especially in love with one girl. Her name is Nadia. And so, of course, there's going to be adventures about video games, about friends, and about doing stupid things, because at 8, when you are starting to become a teenager, you do stupid things. So when I was 11, actually, Titeuf was all the rage, really. It was very, very popular amongst the people at my school. And the author actually wrote a book about becoming an adolescent that a lot of people of my generation have actually read. Another great comic is Le Marsupilami. Now, Le Marsupilami is a weird creature, and all we know about him is that he lives in a forest of Palombia, and that his tail is extremely long and surprisingly strong. He's a yellow character with black spots on it. And the Marsupilami is a family man. His wife and him have 3 little children, Marsupilamis. They have Bibi, Bibu, and Bobo. And those 3 ones, they constantly get in trouble. And it doesn't really help that Europeans tend to try to capture the Marsupilami because they are very expensive, and they would make them really rich if they were taking them back to Europe. So this comic is a good one to start if you are a beginner, because the Marsupilami doesn't speak. not in words anyway, he does a lot of things, but so there isn't a lot of text in the Marsupilami comics, but it's very funny, and this little creatures is extremely cute. Then we have Spirou and Fantasio. Spirou and Fantasio, that's very interesting actually. In the world of French comics, Spirou is actually a magazine, le magazine Spirou. And that's where most of the comics that we talked about today have actually been launched. It's where all those comics started to develop. So it's obviously I couldn't not mention Spirou and Fantasio, even though I never really got to what makes Spirou and Fantasio very, very great. Spirou is also the name of a character, so Spirou also has his own sets of comic, and he's a brilliant journalist, just like Tintin. And in the comic series, he is investigating mysteries with his friend Fantasio, which is grumpy, a little bit like Haddock, but the vibe is totally different. And he has also a pet squirrel, which is a word that I can pronounce in English. Now, the series shares obviously a lot of similarities with Tintin. There is investigations, there is grumpy friends and mad inventors as well, although the tone is completely different. Tintin is very serious, Spirou is quite goofy, right? So if you enjoy something that is a little bit lighter than Tintin, if you don't care too much about modern history, if you don't want to learn things like that, then definitely Spirou would be a much better alternative for you than Tintin. And you'll actually also meet le Marsupilami in Spirou's adventures. Then we have another very interesting comic that is L'élève Ducobu. L'élève Ducobu. Now, Ducobu is a bad boy. That's his, but not a bad boy as in motorcycles and all, because he's a child, but he's a bad boy. He has zero intentions of ever learning anything his teacher is talking about. And, he is very, very bad at school. But it's alright because he sat right next to the most intelligent girl of the class. So he only needs to copy her answers, right, to be able to pass. Without her noticing, of course, because she doesn't like him very much. He's quite resourceful in that matter, but his genius plans never quite end up being perfect. And the whole of the French, the L'élève Ducobu comics are about him trying to get the answers or trying to do some mischief. The last one on our list actually is the most Belgian of the cowboys out there, and it's Lucky Luke. Lucky Luke is a cowboy, and he has a smart horse called Jolly Jumper, and he has also a stupid dog called Rantanplan. And he's here to enforce the law on Western bandits, especially on the notorious Dalton gang. Now, this Western comic will surely steal your heart if you're a fan of adventurous gangsters and hero that can fire faster than their own shadow. Although it's not American, it's very European in a lot of ways. And if you ever actually speak with a Frenchman, you can ask him if on his wallpaper when he was a kid probably wasn't there any Lucky Luke posters or even stuff. My ex actually had his whole bedroom covered in Lucky Luke stuff. It was very sexy, to say the least. Now, so that's it. We have our 10 French comics here. If you are not too much into comics, but that you want to get into reading, I actually have a list of French books for you to download. You can check the description, and I'll see you in another video, or you can actually watch this video straight away.